The air in the grand ballroom of Buckingham Palace was thick with the scent of lilies and the suffocating weight of 300 years of protocol. It was supposed to be a night of polished perfection, a state banquet, where every smile was practiced and every diamond was a calculated move in the game of international diplomacy. But as the first course was served under the amber glow of the chandeliers, a chilling silence began to ripple outward from the head table. Princess Catherine, usually the master of stoic grace, sat perfectly still. Her body had understood the shock before her mind could even process the violation. Pinched against the silk of Queen Camilla's gown was a cluster of diamonds and emeralds that caught the light with a cruel, cold precision. It was the Prince of Wales's feathers brooch. It was not a similar piece. It was not a tribute. It was the exact jewel that had once sat over the heart of Diana, Princess of Wales. Catherine did not blink. She did not look away. In that singular, terrifying instant, the banquet ceased to be a celebration of state and became a visceral psychological battlefield where the living were forced to confront the ghosts of the past. Camilla felt the stare land on her sharp, unmistakable, and laden with a fury that no tiara could deflect. Almost by instinct, the Queen Consort's fingers moved toward the brooch, a micro-gesture of insecurity that betrayed her composure. Prince William noticed the movement first. His gaze shifted from his wife's pale face to the emeralds on his stepmother's chest, and something inside him hardened into stone. This was not a simple ornament. It was a memory pinned to silk. It was a fragment of his mother's identity, a piece of jewelry that Catherine believed should never have been worn without permission, without respect, or without the explicit blessing of the children who still carried the scars of 1997. The banquet mattered because it was a theater of power, and on this stage Camilla had chosen to wear a symbol that didn't belong to her. Charles had wanted this evening to be a masterpiece of unity, a signal to the world that the golden illusion of the new reign was stable. But by allowing that brooch to leave the vault, he had invited a shadow back into the room that he had spent 30 years trying to outrun. William slowly reached for Catherine's hand beneath the table, his knuckles white with the strain of suppressed emotion. He wasn't trying to stop her. He was trying to anchor her. He felt her pull back gently, a tiny movement that told him everything. The princess was not acting from a sudden burst of temper. She was acting from a deep tectonic pain. Camilla looked down, then up again, her face shifting as she realized that her attempt at reconciliation through jewelry had backfired into a public disaster. Charles saw it too. The king's expression tightened, his fingers gripping the edge of his crystal glass until it threatened to shatter. The room kept breathing, but barely. Then Catherine did the unthinkable. She rose from her chair, her silk gown rustling in a silence that had become dangerous. Servers froze with silver trays in midair. Guests at the lower tables looked toward the head table with bated breath. William stood half a second later, a silent sentinel who was no longer just the heir, but a son protecting a legacy. Catherine's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a verdict. She asked for the service to stop. It was a breach of etiquette so profound, it felt like a declaration of war. Camilla froze her hand hovering near the emeralds, as if they had suddenly turned into live coals. Charles looked from his wife to his daughter-in-law, and in that moment, he realized that his authority had been usurped by moral clarity. This was the shattering of the evening. Before the room could understand why the future queen had halted the most formal dinner of the year, the people closest to the Spencer legacy began to realize that a line had been crossed that could never be uncrossed. To Camilla, the brooch was a trophy of acceptance, a way to say the past was settled. To Catherine, it was a borrowed dignity that felt like theft. To William, it was his mother's shadow returning at the worst possible moment, reminding him that even in the highest halls of power, grief is never truly settled. The psychological wound did not begin at the banquet table. It had been festering for weeks inside the lead-lined recesses of the Royal Jewellery Archive. This is a space where every piece is a fact, every stone a history. During a private family ceremony intended to review Diana's personal pieces, for a future memorial tribute, Catherine had made one specific request: that the brooch remain untouched until William decided its place. She wanted it protected, not as a royal asset, but as a human inheritance. William had entered that meeting already tense, his jaw locked in the way it always was when his mother's name was mentioned. He didn't touch the velvet case. He only stared at the swallow of truth it contained. But Camilla, according to documented accounts from senior aides, had made a quiet request to Charles. She believed that wearing the brooch at the state banquet would be a powerful gesture of unity, a way to signal that the divisions of the 90s had finally been healed. She wanted to use Diana's light to shine on her own crown. Charles, caught in his own paradox of wanting to please his wife while avoiding conflict with his son, had stayed silent. In the world of the palace, silence is often mistaken for permission. When Catherine learned of the request through Sophie, her trusted confidant, she felt a sense of disturbance that went beyond protocol. She understood that unity cannot be manufactured by taking another woman's pain and pinning it to your gown. Reconciliation is earned through time and respect, not through the appropriation of symbols. William had spoken to his father that same evening, his voice heavy with a hurt that was almost surgical in its precision. He told the king the brooch should remain in the vault. But the king did not promise. He left the door open, a mistake that would culminate in the disastrous silence of the banquet hall. When Catherine saw the emeralds under the chandeliers, she knew the private warning had been ignored. The king had stayed silent. The queen consort had pushed forward, and William had been forced to face his mother's ghost in front of the entire world. "Why are you wearing it?" Catherine's question was a philosophical punchline that cut through the fluff of royal titles. It was a demand for truth in a room built on illusions. Camilla tried to answer with the practiced calm of a royal consort, but her voice failed her halfway through the sentence. She realized that the guests might not know the history, but the family did. The micro detail of her shaking hand as she touched the jewel told the story better than any speech could. She was exposed. She was a woman wearing a memory she hadn't earned. William rose beside Catherine, his presence a shield. He didn't speak, but his face carried the grief he usually hid behind a mask of duty. This was his mother's jewelry, the pieces he remembered her wearing when she tucked him in, now being used as a styling choice for a state dinner. It was a violation of the root wound that defined his entire adult life. Charles leaned toward Camilla and issued a command in a low, dangerous rumble: "Remove it." The king understood that the situation was no longer about a piece of jewelry. It was about the survival of his own authority. He saw Anne watching from across the table, her face carved in cold certainty. The Princess Royal did not offer comfort. She offered a warning. She told Charles in a whisper that this was about judgment, not ornaments. A symbol once seen cannot be unseen. It lives in the public imagination, a permanent record of a family's inability to respect its own dead. Camilla hesitated, a single breath of defiance that caused the king's face to darken. That hesitation was the point of no return. Catherine's stand was not just for her husband. It was for the integrity of the monarchy itself. She refused to sit down. She refused to let the service continue until the insult was removed. The fallout of the banquet moved with the speed of a cinematic edit. Catherine was escorted to a private sitting room, a space where rank could no longer protect anyone. In this room, the golden illusion of the royal family was stripped away, leaving only two women facing each other in the long shadow of a tragedy. Catherine told Camilla with a quiet sadness that was more devastating than any shout that acceptance cannot be borrowed from someone else's grief. You cannot pin a woman's legacy to your chest and call it peace. Camilla, for the first time in her long journey toward the throne, looked broken. The shame was not in the brooch itself, but in the realization that she had tried to force a reconciliation that the heart was not ready for. She opened the velvet case with trembling fingers, removed the brooch, and placed it on the table between them. It was a surrender. By morning, the information density of the digital age had turned the private clash into a national obsession. The image of Catherine standing at the banquet table was the commercial cinematic moment of the year. The public did not need an official statement to understand the emotional truth. They saw a woman protecting the memory of the princess they had never forgotten. They saw the nostalgia factor weaponized as a form of stewardship. Kensington Palace was flooded with white flowers, a silent tribute to Diana that reminded everyone that her story is not history, it is a living, breathing part of the national psyche. Charles, facing the twilight angle of his leadership, was forced to act. He signed a new rigid protocol. Diana's personal jewelry archive would be placed under a triple lock system, requiring the written agreement of both William and the sovereign before any piece could be moved. It was a surgical correction to a system that had failed. The aftertaste of the brooch incident was a new cold clarity within the household. The palace corridors were quiet, but it was a silence of fear, not ceremony. Staff moved with unusual caution, aware that a single mistake in ceremonial order could now end a career. Camilla withdrew into a period of quiet reflection, the empty space on her gown. A permanent reminder that some things are too sacred to be used as tools of public relations. William saw Catherine's strength and realized that she had done what he as a son could not do. Without appearing biased, she had defended the dignity of his mother as a matter of royal principle. She had proven that loyalty to the crown does not mean silence. It means knowing when the line of human decency has been crossed. This was the night the future queen established her own root wound. A commitment to the emotional truth of the monarchy over the fluff of its protocol. Catherine had tilled the garden of the royal jewelry archive and found that the most valuable things weren't the diamonds, but the memories they carried. She had provided the healing the audience didn't know they needed, proving that the next reign would not be built by erasing the past, but by honoring it with the honesty that the previous generation had lacked. The brooch was returned to its lid-lined recess, a ghost sent back to its grave. But its flight had changed the architecture of the palace forever. The paradox of the state banquet was that it was a failure of statecraft, but a triumph of humanity. Charles remains the king, but Catherine emerged as the guardian of the family's conscience. The punchline of the evening was simple. A crown is a loan of power, but memory is an inheritance of the soul. You can change the laws of succession, but you cannot change the law of the heart. The Princess Royal's warning to Charles remained the final verdict. On the crisis, it was about judgment. And in the theatre of the British monarchy, judgment is the only thing that separates a legend from a scandal. The swallow had flown home, and for the first time in decades the room was quiet, because the truth had finally been spoken. The legacy of the emeralds will be written not in the inventory of the royal collection, but in the hearts of the people who watched a woman stand up when everyone else stayed seated. Catherine had secured the future of the crown by refusing to let it be cruel to its own past. She had shown the micro detail of what it means to be a queen. It is not the weight of the diamonds you wear, but the weight of the truths you are willing to defend. William and Catherine walked out of the banquet room not as heirs, but as the recognized stewards of a memory that belongs to the world. And as the curtains closed on the most explosive state dinner in decades, the silence was no longer heavy. It was the peace of a debt finally paid. Thank you for witnessing this cinematic unmasking of the royal heart. If you recognize the gravity of this stand, if you understand why a simple piece of jewelry can shake the foundation of a monarchy, then join our community. Subscribe to our channel as we continue to peel back the velvet curtains on the lives that defined a century, the lives that were lived in the brightest spotlights and the darkest shadows. What do you think about Catherine's decision to stop the banquet? Was it an act of defiance or an act of stewardship? Does the Queen Consort have the right to wear the jewels of the woman she replaced? Share your thoughts in the comments. The stories of the sovereigns and the stars never truly end. They just wait for the next chapter to be written. The lights of the ballroom are still shining, but the memory of the brooch is louder. The truth has found its way to the surface, and the silence is finally broken. Keep looking for the truth behind the glamour, for that is where the real story lives. The cinematic journey through the ruins of the Royal Archive continues, and we will be here to witness every shattering moment. Goodbye for now, but the conversation has only just begun. Stay with us. The story is far from over.